Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to dive straight into Davinci Resolve and look at my workflow for editing a documentary. Now this workflow can be used obviously for smaller projects, for smaller corporate brand films, but the idea with this workflow is that it's really simple, but it's also robust enough to be scaled up to bigger projects such as a documentary. This video is definitely something that I wish I would have seen when I first started editing longer form projects, because these types of projects can become overwhelming really quickly because there's so much raw footage to deal with. With this particular project, there was over 30 interviews and 26 terabytes of data from a whole range of different cameras and different sources, and footage shot over the period of about 2 years. So tons of data to work with, and to try and just wrap your head around how much data there is and then try and distill a cohesive, powerful story out of that is actually quite a feat. But one thing that really helps with that whole process is a robust workflow. The documentary is linked in the description to this video below. This is really an extended brand film. So it's definitely a brand piece about a brand and the work that they're doing raising king salmon here in the top of the south of New Zealand. So it is a brand film, but the way we approached it is applicable to many types of documentaries as well. So we've got the final timeline here, but what I really want to focus on is the workflow around file management, which you can see up here in the media pool. So it's really simple. There's just 4 folders, one for footage and audio. Other people like to call this dailies. One for music references, one for assets, and one for timeline. Let's take a look first at the footage and audio folder and how we organize all of our dailies. So if we expand this, you can see every single one of these line items here is a new day or a specific day that was shot for this project. And if we expand that, you can see there are cameras and audio sources within that day. So on the 11th of the 11th, 2020, Day 6 was shot at the Takaka hatchery, and you can see here we've got an A cam, which was an Ursa, we've got an audio source and a B cam, and then also a backup of the A cam, which was recorded as a proxy within the Atomos Ninja 5. Now all of these green line items here are days where we went and shot a whole lot of footage, but not necessarily any interviews. Where the interviews are stored are under these blue sections here. So if we expand this, all of the formal interviews are broken down into the subjects. So if we look, for example, at Anya O'Neill here on the 28th of the 10th, 2020, we filmed a formal interview with Anya O'Neill, and you can see here the camera sources and the audio sources are all here. So it's just one clip for A cam, a few clips for audio, and one clip for B cam. This is organized for every single formal interview all the way down, and then we have a whole range of informal interviews here. The difference between formal and informal interviews is simply that informal interviews are in situ interviews where the subject is walking around the facility or the scene that they're in, and it's not necessarily a sit-down formal interview. The informal interviews can also be classed as B-roll or cutaway footage, but I like to categorize them as informal interviews because there's often a lot of dialogue content in these informal interviews that is really valuable for the documentary story. So if they're classed as informal interviews and organized as such, then it just helps my mind, I guess, give that more priority than the B-roll cutaway shots that we'll add in later. So that's basically it for all of the dailies. As you can see, the file structure at the top is really simple when you just look at footage and audio. You've got a nice clean folder structure, but as you break it down and go behind the surface with all of the folder structures, it does become quite robust. If this was a bigger production with, let's say, 6 to 8 cameras, then simply within the dailies, you would just have more folders for all of the different cameras, and it would be expanded on just like that. Okay, so once we have all of our footage organized within the dailies folder, the next step is to start creating what we call stringouts for each of the days. And this just helps us visualize all of the footage within a timeline. So that's where the timelines folder 04 down here comes into play. We'll break these down the further we go into this tutorial, but what I want to look at first of all is just the B-roll Stringouts 02. So every single one of these timelines, which you can see here on the right, represents one of the Dailies folders on the left, and it's simply just all of the footage that was shot on that specific day strung out in one timeline. For example, on the 18th of the 2nd, 2021, the tent burn hatchery. If we double click on that and open it up. So all the footage within this timeline is a string out of day 17 tent burn hatchery footage. As you can see here, we've got a whole range of different cameras, and that is all represented within this tent burn hatchery B-roll string out. So as we scroll through, we can just scrub through all of the footage back to back, and at a bird's eye view, see everything that was captured on that one day. So in this B-roll Stringouts folder, we simply have a string out of every single one of the days in a timeline. This is simply just an organizational technique. It's a way that you can preview the footage really quickly. For example, if the director wants to come in and see all of the footage that was shot on that particular day, it's right there, ready to go. Once we have our string out, I like to go ahead and duplicate the string out to create what I call a selects reel. And that is simply going through, watching every single shot within the string out and selecting the best bits, or selecting the bits that I think will make the cut later. Now that there's a selects reel for every single day that we shot on production, it's just a really quick way to preview all of the usable shots throughout that day of production. And this is really handy because when I'm back in the edit and perhaps I'm stuck with a shot specifically from that day, or it's just not quite gelling, I can go back to my selects reel and watch through the 13 minutes of footage and find fresh inspiration to pull footage from into my main timeline. So essentially what we have at this point is all of our footage organized into folders, and then all of this footage is then translated into a timeline, which is a string out of everything from the day. I then go through and watch the string out and make my selects and duplicate that into B-roll breakdowns, which is this selects reel here you can see. So now the third layer of this organizational workflow is to take those selects reels and to start to categorize the B-roll into themes. That's what 04 B-roll themed breakdowns is here. So throughout this documentary, there's obviously key themes that we're trying to illustrate with the B-roll. And because this is quite an informative documentary, the B-roll does a lot of illustrating when it comes to the storyline. So there's definitely key themes within the B-roll that we want to isolate and slowly start building mini sequences around all of those individual themes of the documentary. So at this point, I'm not doing any creative editing. I'm simply still organizing footage into little categories, into bins. So if we look at 04 B-roll themed breakdowns, we now have a whole lot of sub-themes that we can start populating with all of our B-roll selects. So for example, let's go to the establishing aerials of the Takaka hatchery, which is what TH is. Now I have a string out of all of the selects of good footage of the Takaka hatchery in the form of establishing aerials. So if we watch through this, you can see there's just some really beautiful landscape shots, and they're all really usable. They look great, they're exposed well, and they're shots that I'm potentially going to select for the final timeline. If we take a look at another example, we have the sea farms and all of the shots that contain dolphins in them. So here in this sequence, we have a minute 20 of usable dolphin footage within the sea farms.
Do some tricks, y'all. Got him.
So all of this footage here has been selected from all of the previous B-roll breakdown selects. So hopefully you can see that by categorizing all of this footage within the B-roll themed breakdowns and also having string outs and select reels for each day, I'm starting to get a really clear picture of all of the footage that I'm working with. And that's the most important thing when you're editing such a big story like this. You want to know where every single shot is within your media pool. You don't want to be scrambling around in the edit trying to find a shot that you know is there. And that's where a clear workflow structure, a clear organizational strategy comes into play when editing documentaries. So that is all of the B-roll that has been organized. Now let's look at all of the A roll, which is all of the interview sync, and how I've organized that and started to distill a story from so many formal and informal interviews. So as we mentioned earlier, we have all of our informal interviews and formal interviews categorized as blue here, and each name represents one interview with that one person, and all of the footage for that one interview is organized nicely into folders. Now what we do is the same process as we did initially with the B-roll, and that's down here under timelines, O1, A-roll, string out markups. So you can see here under interview string outs, what I have done is for every single interview that we shot, I've created a synced string out specifically for that one interview. And that essentially means it's a timeline with all of the camera sources, all of the audio sources, all synced up and locked together. And that is what we call a string out of this interview. So you can see here it's marked with the clapper. And then as we go through, everything is nicely organized. Now what we need to do is simply create a string out for every single formal and informal interview. As you can see here, we have a ton of timelines with all of the different interviews for this project. That's what these string outs are. They're simply a way to organize all of your source footage into a timeline where you can always refer back to the original sync. Now, one thing that you probably notice up here is a whole lot of markers. In this video, I don't really have time to talk too much about these markers, but essentially what we've done is we've exported this string out, uploaded it to a program called Simon Says, and then that automatically transcribes these interviews using AI. Then what we do is we round trip it back into Davinci Resolve, and Simon Says allows us to bring in the transcription as markers within the timeline. This is probably the key to holding this whole documentary together, because all of the IP in the interviews is simply in the markers here, and I can access the information from those markers using the edit index up here. So if you've never used the edit index before, it's a powerful way to see all of the changes or edits within the timeline, and using the three-dot menu, you can filter the things that you want to see within the edit index. Now simply I've just selected show markers and show all markers. And what that does is it brings up the transcription that's been brought in from Simon Says for this entire interview right here. Now what's really cool is I can go up here, choose all fields, and I can literally search for any word. Let's say salmon, because that's what this interview is about. There are now all of these references that I can see of Anya O'Neill in this interview talking with the word salmon within her sentence. So this is a really powerful way to quickly find those key themes and key words within a really long form interview. Traditionally, you would have the transcriptions given to you in a stack of papers next to your desk, but having the transcription as markers within your timeline is so powerful when it comes to using the edit index to quickly know where every single specific word is within an interview. What's also really powerful about having your transcriptions within an edit index is that you can quickly isolate individual words if you are having trouble with the inflection of certain phrases. For example, you might cut a sentence halfway and the last word within that sentence sounds unfinished, or it is rising in terms of its inflection, and you might want to go back to the original interview and search for that specific word that you want to change, and then you'll have references for every time that word appears within the overall interview, and then you'll have a whole range of words to be able to choose and replace if you are trying to change that inflection. So again, a really powerful way of working. And this is honestly probably the key to this whole documentary workflow. All right, so now we have all of our interviews laid out as string outs with the transcription as markers within the timeline. Now the second step from here, just like with the B-roll, is to duplicate that timeline. And over here, I've created a whole series of what I like to call interview selects. Now an interview select, for example, now with Anya O'Neill, it's about 5 minutes of selected statements from Anya O'Neill's interview, and I've identified key statements and key themes that she is talking about within her interview. You'll notice on the selects, I've removed all of the transcription markers, and I've started to create my own reference markers, which you can also see here under the edit index. These blue markers here are my words that I've added in as I've listened through the interview, and they're just a way of prompting me to remember what is actually in these interviews. So now there's 2 layers of organization with my interviews. I've distilled all the key themes down within the selects. Then what I want to do is go another step further, just like with the B-roll, and that is to create A-roll sync pools. Now these pools here are essentially selections from all of the interviews, and I'm organizing them into categories or into themed groups. And then I'm starting to create timelines specifically around a specific aspect of the story. Now, all of these timelines can be found under 05 A-roll sync pools. And you can see here, if you just read through these are all of the themes that I've categorized and pulled selects from all of the interviews into these folders to start creating these themed based story timelines. Now the result of all of this hard work, because it is a lot of work to get to this stage, but what we have now is a really beautiful organizational structure where we have every single key theme that will possibly appear in the final documentary. And we've got little mini string outs of all of the interview talent speaking to that specific topic. So it really sets us up for a win when it comes to pulling all of this down into a master timeline. All right, so that's a lot of information so far. Let's recap really quick before we move on further. What we have is we have all of our footage, whether it's interviews, formal interviews or informal interviews, or all of our B-roll footage shot on various different cameras and all of our audio sources. We've got all of them categorized and organized within the footage and audio folder, which is up here under Dailies. This is all of our raw footage, and all of this raw footage is then translated into Dailies Stringouts, which is under here under timelines. So all of our interview stringouts are organized nicely here per person. All of our B-roll stringouts are organized via the day that they were shot. And then what we do is do a second layer of selects. So that's when we're watching through all of the B-roll and taking out the pieces that we like and just getting rid of the pieces that we don't like. Remember, we can go back at any single time to the original footage up here if we want to source a clip that perhaps was omitted when we created the selects reel. But we're just slowly refining the footage that we want to use in the final edit. So we have our B-roll selects, and then we do the same with the A-roll interviews. So we create interview selects, which are all here. The original interviews were anywhere between 45 to an hour long interviews, and the selects reels are generally 5 to 10 minutes of just the good bits and the relevant bits for this particular documentary. After the selects reels for both the A-roll and the B-roll, we start to do themed pools. We've created categories or themed based sequences for every single topic that the documentary will be covering. This was largely inspired by the content that came out of the interviews. So as you're listening through an interview, you might hear the interviewee talk about a particular topic, and then that will become a topic within the A-roll sync pools here. And that's the basis of all of the organization when it comes to documentary editing. And then what we have is a great foundation to start doing our creative editing. Now, the first step is to just get something on the timeline when it comes to a first draft. At this point in the project, it can be very overwhelming because you have all of these ideas floating around in your head as to how you're going to tell the long form story. It's your job as the editor to distill all of that and take the first step in creating a timeline for the story. So my approach to this is to start with the A-roll. Everything should be based around the interviews because the interviews are naturally where the story is being told. And if we can have a strong story with the interviews that is supported by strong B-roll, that is supported by strong music, then we're going to have a strong story. I'm going to stop the video there because we've already talked about so much. Maybe we'll do a part 2. But I really wanted to give you a high-level idea of how to organize your footage in a way that helps you creatively edit when it comes to documentary editing. If you have any questions, please let me know. Add a comment in the comment box below, hit the bell notification to like and subscribe to this channel. Your support is much appreciated. But most importantly, please comment below what you would like to see more of, because I really want to be giving you value and giving you value in areas that you actually need. So it'd be great to get some idea of what you'd like to see more of, and I'll be sure to make videos on them to come. For now, peace out and thanks very much for tuning in.